February 1969, Las Vegas, Nevada. The International Hotel on Paradise Road, still under construction, the tallest hotel in the city and the largest in the world. Its unfinished upper floors visible against the desert sky like a promise nobody had fully made yet. In a conference room on the fourth floor, a meeting is taking place between Kirk Kerkorian, who owns the building, and a small group of men who are deciding who will open it. The name on the table is Elvis Presley. The name being argued against it belongs to Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, in February 1969, was 53 years old and the undisputed sovereign of Las Vegas entertainment. He had been performing at the Sands since 1953. He had made the city in his own image: the tuxedos, the cigarettes, the tumbler of Jack Daniels on the piano, the casual mastery of a man who treated a showroom the way other men treated their living rooms. Las Vegas was Frank's room. Everybody in that fourth-floor conference room understood this. The question being debated was whether the room was big enough for someone else. The International Hotel's main showroom held 2,000 people. It was the largest showroom ever built in Las Vegas. Nobody had ever performed for 2,000 people in Las Vegas on a nightly basis. Nobody knew if it could be done. If a single performer could fill that room, night after night, in a city that ran on spectacle and had seen everything. Frank Sinatra's people said it couldn't be done with Elvis. What they said specifically, according to the people present in that room, was that Elvis Presley was a phenomenon of the 1950s, that the screaming teenagers had grown up and moved on, that Elvis had spent 7 years making movies that nobody took seriously, that Las Vegas audiences were sophisticated adults who wanted Sinatra and Bennett and Martin, not a former rockabilly singer from Mississippi who shook his hips. One of the men in the room later said that the phrase used was, "He's too Memphis for this room." Elvis was not in the room. He was told about the conversation later, in a specific and detailed way, by someone who thought he should know. He listened to all of it. He did not respond with anger or with the performing of hurt feelings, or with any of the conventional reactions available to a man being told that his time has passed. He was 34 years old. He had been famous for 13 years. He had heard the conversation before, in different rooms, from different directions, and he had developed, over those 13 years, a particular way of receiving it. He received it quietly, and then he went to work. What happened next in the rehearsal rooms and recording studios of early 1969 is not a mystery. It is documented in extraordinary detail by the musicians and producers who were present for it. What Elvis did in the months between that February meeting and his July opening at the International was reconstruct himself from the inside out. Not reinvent, reconstruct. He went back to the music that had made him before the movies made him something else. He hired musicians who could hold a stage the way a stage needed to be held. He built a show that was not the show of a man trying to prove something, but the show of a man who had been waiting a long time to remember who he was. The rehearsals were, by all accounts, relentless. Elvis worked in ways that surprised people who had worked with him before. He was the first one in the room and the last one out. He ran songs until they were not just learned, but inhabited. He was, in those months, the opposite of the man that the February meeting had described. Not a relic of the 1950s coasting on faded legend, but someone building something new from materials that had always been there, waiting. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. July 26, 1969. The International Hotel showroom, 8:30 in the evening. The room held 2,000 people. It was sold out. It had been sold out since the tickets went on sale. There was a waiting list. There were people in Las Vegas that night who had not been able to get tickets and who were in other showrooms or at card tables or in their hotel rooms listening through walls, because the walls of the International Hotel in July 1969 were not yet fully soundproofed, and the bass from the showroom carried. Elvis Presley walked onto that stage, and the 2,000 people in the room came to their feet before he had sung a single note. What followed was 57 minutes of performance that the people who were present for it would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately and never quite managing. The reviews written the next morning, and every major newspaper and music publication in the country sent someone, reached for words and came up slightly short. Not because the writers were inadequate, but because the thing they had witnessed was slightly larger than the available vocabulary. He was not the Elvis of the 1950s. He was not the Elvis of the movies. He was something that had not existed before that night, a performer at absolute command of himself and his audience, drawing on everything he had ever known about music and presence, and the specific electricity that moves between a human being and a room full of people who are entirely with him. He played for 57 minutes and received 4 standing ovations during the performance, not at the end. The show ran for 4 weeks. Every performance sold out. 57 shows, 101,500 people in total, not one empty seat. The previous Las Vegas attendance record for a single engagement had been held by Marlene Dietrich. Before that, by Liberace. The record Elvis set that July was not broken for years, by anyone. Frank Sinatra was in Las Vegas that month. He was performing at another property. He sent a note backstage after the opening night that Elvis kept for the rest of his life, and the contents of which were never made public by anyone who knew what was in it. What is known is that Frank Sinatra attended one of the performances during that 4-week run. Not the opening night, but a later one, unreported, unannounced, sitting in a booth at the back of the 2,000-seat room to watch a show that his people had told a conference room in February could not be done with that particular performer. What he thought of what he saw, he did not tell anyone on record, but he watched the whole show. He did not leave early. He did not send word ahead that he was there. He sat in a booth at the back of the largest showroom in Las Vegas, and he watched Elvis Presley perform for 57 minutes in a room that held 2,000 people and had not had an empty seat since the day the tickets went on sale. The man who watched that show was not the same man who had been in the 4th floor conference room in February. Or rather, he was exactly the same man, and the show had shown him something that the conference room had not contained. Elvis was told afterward that Frank had been in the room. He was told which night, which booth, how long he stayed. He did not make a public statement about it. He did not tell the press. He did not use it as a vindication or a counter-argument to the February conversation. He filed it in the same place he filed most things, quietly, without comment, in the interior ledger that kept the account of what had happened and what it had cost and what it had proved. He had not done the July engagement to prove the February meeting wrong. He had done it to remember who he was. The proving wrong was a consequence, not the point. This is a distinction that the people who knew Elvis well tried, in various ways and across many years, to explain to people who found it difficult to believe. That he was not, at his core, a competitive man in the conventional sense. That he did not perform to beat other people. That the February meeting in the International Hotel conference room had not made him angry in the way that such a meeting makes most people angry, with the hot, specific anger of someone told they are less than they believe themselves to be. It had made him quiet, and then it had made him work. Charlie Hodge, who was with Elvis in the rehearsals and in the room on opening night, said it this way. He wasn't trying to prove Frank wrong. He was trying to prove himself right. There's a difference. Frank was irrelevant to what Elvis was doing in that room. What was relevant was the music and the people who came to hear it. The International Hotel became the Las Vegas Hilton in 1971. Elvis performed there regularly for the next 8 years, until his final Las Vegas engagement in December 1976. Over those 8 years, he performed 837 shows in that room. The total attendance across those 837 shows has been calculated at various figures, all of them so large that the numbers have a way of losing meaning when you look at them too long. What does not lose meaning is the February meeting. The phrase, "to Memphis for this room," the conference table and the men around it, and the certainty with which they described what Elvis Presley could and could not do in a showroom that held 2,000 people. And then July 26, 1969, 8:30 in the evening, the room sold out. The waiting list, the bass carrying through the not yet soundproofed walls to the people who couldn't get in. Elvis walking onto the stage. The 2,000 people on their feet before he sang a single note. There is a photograph taken that opening night from the back of the International Hotel showroom, looking toward the stage. Elvis is at the microphone, mid-song, the lights behind him. The audience is visible in the foreground. 2,000 people, every seat filled, the room saturated with a specific quality of attention that only exists when a performer and an audience have found each other completely. The photograph does not show Frank Sinatra's booth. He was not there that night. He came later, unannounced, and sat in the back and watched. And nobody photographed that. Some things you have to take on testimony. The testimony in this case comes from several people who were present and who have no particular reason to have invented it. Frank Sinatra came to a booth at the back of the room and watched Elvis Presley perform and did not leave until it was over. That is the whole of what is known. It is, in its own way, enough. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977. He was 42 years old. The International Hotel, by then the Las Vegas Hilton, retired his name from the showroom marquee and did not book another performer in his place for the remainder of that year. Frank Sinatra outlived him by 21 years. He died in 1998. In the decades between Elvis's death and his own, Sinatra spoke publicly about Elvis on several occasions, always with the particular respect of one serious craftsman for another. He called him the greatest entertainer who ever lived. He said it more than once. He said it in ways that made it clear he meant it. The February 1969 conference room was a long time ago by then. The phrase, "to Memphis for this room," had been answered in the only language that ever actually settles that kind of argument. 2,000 people on their feet before the first note, 837 shows, and a booth at the back of the room where the man who said it came, one night, to watch. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who has been told they are too something for somewhere. Subscribe for more stories about what happens when the people who were counted out decide to do the work anyway. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been told you couldn't do something and then done it? Those are the stories worth hearing. Leave them below. There is something worth sitting with in the specific shape of what happened between February and July of 1969. A meeting in a conference room, a phrase, a man who heard the phrase and did not argue, did not perform outrage, did not call a press conference. A man who went into a rehearsal room and worked. The working is the part that gets left out of most versions of this story. The July opening is the part that gets remembered. The sold-out room, the standing ovations, the records broken. But the months between February and July are the actual story. The early mornings in the rehearsal space, the musicians running the same song until it was not just right, but inevitable. The decisions made about what the show would be and what it would not be. That it would not be nostalgia, that it would not be the 1950s reassembled for an audience that remembered the 1950s. That it would be something that had not existed before, built from everything Elvis had learned in 13 years of being the most famous person in any room he entered. That is what those months were. Not preparation for a comeback, preparation for a beginning. When Elvis walked onto the stage at the International Hotel on July 26, 1969, he was not walking out to prove something to the men in the February conference room. He had stopped thinking about the conference room somewhere in the rehearsal months. What he was walking out to do was simpler and more difficult than proving anything. He was walking out to be exactly who he was, in the largest room Las Vegas had ever built for that purpose. For 2,000 people who had bought tickets weeks in advance and waited and were now on their feet before he had opened his mouth. He gave them 57 minutes. They gave him 4 standing ovations before it was over. And somewhere in the city, in another showroom, the man who had said, "To Memphis for this room," was performing his own show to his own sold-out audience, and would come some nights later, quietly, to a booth at the back of the International Hotel to see what "To Memphis" looked like when it filled 2,000 seats and did not leave a single one empty. What he saw, he kept to himself. What he did, coming, staying, watching until it was over, is its own kind of answer. The musicians who played those July shows remember them the same way. Not as a victory lap, not as a comeback, as a beginning. As the sound of a man who had been waiting for the right room to remind himself what he could do, and had finally found it in the largest room Las Vegas had ever built, on a July night in 1969, with 2,000 people on their feet, and the desert dark and hot outside, and the bass carrying through the walls to the people who had not been able to get in. James Burton, who played lead guitar behind Elvis for those shows and for the years that followed, put it this way in an interview years later. "You could feel it from the first rehearsal. Something had come back, not come back, arrived. Something that had been there all along, but had been waiting for the right moment to be fully itself." That is what the International Hotel was. That is what July 1969 was, the right moment. And Elvis was ready for it in a way that you cannot manufacture or schedule or predict. He was just ready. The room was there, and he was ready. And what happened was what happens when those two things exist at the same time. Frank Sinatra understood that. He understood it from a booth at the back of the room, watching. He had been in enough right moments himself to know one when he saw it. He stayed until it was over. He did not send word ahead. He did not make it about himself. He came and he watched, and he left. That, in its own way, was its own kind of tribute. From one serious man to another, from the sovereign of a room to the man who had just proved the room was big enough for someone else. The phrase, "To Memphis for this room." And then July 26, 1969, and the 2,000 people on their feet, and the 57 minutes, and the booth at the back where Frank Sinatra sat one night and watched until it was over. The International Hotel still stands on Paradise Road in Las Vegas, though it has changed names several times since 1969. The showroom where Elvis performed 837 times still exists in roughly the form it had then. People stand in it on tours and take photographs and try to imagine what it held on opening night in July 1969, when a man from Tupelo, Mississippi, walked out onto the stage and 2,000 people rose to their feet before he said a word. It is not difficult to imagine if you know the music. If you know what he could do when the room was right and the work had been done and the moment had finally arrived. It is, if anything, one of the easier things to imagine about Elvis Presley, because it was, in the end, exactly who he was.